Yeah, I was just...
I don't quite recognize myself, to be honest. I don't feel like it. I think my body is allergic to cellulose. I'm like, we're just start to itch.
Yeah, I guess it's
Okay.
Check 8.
So we're periscoping?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I've got the link right here. Hey, there we are.
Someone just retweeted.
I think it was
That would be.
and now I
Okay, so if someone chats at me, what do I do? Click this button.
don't know. I've never used it.
On here. A lot of people join. I don't know how to do the chat. I looked. I thought it was this little button.
Saying something? Or it might
Oh, I
just be-
found it. Chat. I guess nobody's chatted me yet. I guess it'll pop up.
I know.
We're
And I look, I'm watching it right here while you guys are playing. I think she's still here. With her arms.
Where can I see? That's not reserved.
Do you need me to sign program for bones right here?
Somebody took it, but I'll get another one. Because I wrote a question down for them.
I wouldn't because it felt very, very good. No, we're doing it without.
Just people recording. No one's chatting me yet. No chat.
Okay.
You may have to talk to me back and forth a little bit. So.
Like it.
Oh yeah, sure.
Oh, can I sit in reserve seating? I'm with the Alabamian. Is that a thing?
You sit on the left, sure.
Can I? Well, you can go wherever you need. Hello, Caitlin. How are you?
This is I don't have meetings with athletes, you know. So where they streaming it to?
You sound like you don't even say president of school, you say president. He's so funny.
Yeah, I can hear it too.
Are they live streaming it like through Twitter?
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Steve Peters, Dean of the College of Fine Arts. It's a pleasure to have this event today and especially to have all of you here. I want to thank you for joining us. This is a marquee event in the College of Fine Arts season, and we're really grateful to the Alabama Humanities Foundation for co-sponsoring this event, and especially to all of you who are here today from UM and Montevallo. I know I've met faculty and students from UAB. I know there are other students and faculty from area universities, and I'd also like to thank those watching us. This event is being streamed live on Periscope. One important role of a College of Fine Arts in a liberal arts university is to generate conversation and stimulate ideas in a public forum. And to that end, we're especially pleased to host Mr. Kirk Saduski here this afternoon, especially on Veterans Day. Allow me to share some highlights of our guest's career thus far. And I say thus far. As a college student, he earned both a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in history. He's been an executive and producer at Playtone Pictures in Los Angeles since 1998. He was the lead executive on HBO's Band of Brothers, co-producer of the highly acclaimed miniseries John Adams, as well as Game Change, and he co-produced the 10-episode TV miniseries I hope you had a chance to see, The Pacific, all for HBO. Mr. Saduski was also co-producer of the documentary David Mccullough, Painting with Words, another incredible documentary I hope you had a chance to see. Also the film Parkland, and he was the executive producer of the documentary He Has Seen War. He was co-executive producer of the CNN 5-episode series, The 60s, which earned him an Emmy nomination for Outstanding Documentary or Nonfiction Series, and another 5-episode TV series, The 70s. And I believe you are in production for the 80s? For CNN. In addition to his work as a producer, Mr. Saduski currently teaches a class in dramatizing nonfiction for film and television at UCLA. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Kirk Saduski.
Thank you, Steve, very much. First of all, I will say just both the 60s were actually 10 episodes, and the 70s were 7 episodes, so I don't want people to think, oh, looking, wait a minute, it said 5, it's all the 60s, yeah. I didn't really prepare, my only prepared remarks today were earlier for the dedication of the Sledge Memorial, and so that's my only prepared remarks. I don't know if any of you were there, but I'm here because we did the Pacific several years ago, and in the making of the Pacific, I got to know the Sledge family, and I don't know how many of you know the story of Dr. Eugene Sledge, who was a biology professor here for many years. And so the family asked me to come down and say a few words at the memorial, which I was honored to do. And talking to some of the other people here, they asked me to come and chat with you guys, which I'm happy to do. As Steve mentioned, I do teach myself. I teach a class, as he said, in dramatizing nonfiction film and television, which is essentially taking true stories. And that's really the one thing what makes the class a little bit, distinguishes the class a little bit, is that I have the students, and it can be in any format, film, television, and we look at different genres, but we always are concentrating on true stories like the Pacific. As I think everything in terms of that I've worked on, that Steve mentioned, that I've worked on, they're all of the things that we've dramatized are all been based true stories. John Adams, Band of Brothers, Game Change, Parkland, are all and the others are all true stories. And I think that if you look at the end of, I promise you at the end of this year when the Academy Award nominations, or beginning of next year I should say, come out, if not a majority, certainly a large percentage of movies that are considered, and if not nominated, would be based on true stories. And that's what I emphasize. I do have a background in history. I went to UCLA for my BA and went to San Francisco State University for my MA. So I love history, and I'm just happy. I'm fortunate enough to work at a company that seems to love it too, and that's a particular focus of ours. So I'm very happy about that. And then I kind of fell into the documentary thing. That happened. We were doing John Adams, and I thought that it would be a good idea maybe to do HBO likes to do a lot of ancillary and supplementary programming and material particularly for their long form stuff. And we thought it would be a good idea to perhaps do a documentary with David Mccullough. And I don't know how familiar any of you are with him, with his work. I don't think it's a stretch to say that he's probably America's premier American historian, his historian of American history. 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner, including for John Adams. Anyway, I thought that he might make an interesting subject. I had started to get to know him a little bit from working on the miniseries. We took it to HBO. They thought it was a great idea, and we took a while to figure out exactly what we were going to do. Then we got the star. Now what are we going to do with them? But and that kind of started. Although now I realized I wasn't a producer on the. We also made a documentary in connection with Band of Brothers, which was called "We Stand Alone Together," which is the guys at the Easy Company when they trained in Toccoa, Georgia. They had to run up every day in basic training. They had to run up a mountain called Currahee. And Currahee is an Indian phrase, or an Indian word that means we stand alone together, which was the perfect catchphrase for them. Anyway, I was not a producer on that. I was an executive on it, but I worked on it much. So that was actually my first adventure in documentary filmmaking. But then, like I said, we did the David Mccullough, and I'm happy to talk. I could talk about that all night. That was such a great adventure. I talk about that. And then HBO also approached us after we had done both Band of Brothers and The Pacific, and they said they would like, now let's put it together. Can we do a documentary that would combine the two? And they left it up to us as to what to do. And we thought that, what have we not seen before? And the thinking was, well, we've seen battle and we know how courageous and all of that, and not to diminish any of it, but what new slant could we bring to it? And we thought, there's very little been done about how the men came home from World War II. There's a lot of talk today, rightfully so, about how veterans transition back to civilian life. But there's very little talk, there's very little thought given to how the men came home from, and it was almost exclusively men at that time, in 1945. And there were 10 million men. And there was the thinking, and I mentioned this earlier at the dedication, that there's the thinking that because the war had such popular support and it was such the right thing to do, that the men had an easy time when they came home. Well, they still had to go home. Well, they were still over there and had to endure horrific conditions and do and suffer things that none of us hopefully will ever have to. Perhaps there may be some vets in here, and I apologize if I overlook you, but most of us are not going to have to ever see combat. And anyway, I think people thought the World War II guys came home to nothing but the GI Bill, ticker tape parades, and everything would be just fine after that. Well, of course, it was much more complicated. So we made a documentary about that. And then CNN approached us a couple years ago, and we said, we'd like to get in business with you. And we said, oh, that sounds interesting. We wanted to do something. I made a movie. I apologize. I co-produced with a lot of people, I promise, a movie called Parkland, which was about the assassination of President Kennedy, and all based on real events. It wasn't in who killed Kennedy or conspiracies. It was really just dramatizing the events around it. And I'll be happy to talk about any of that if you're interested. But we said we want to make a documentary about that. So CNN said that sounds like a great idea. And this was for the 50th anniversary a couple of years ago. Great idea, but in addition to that, we'd like to make a series about the entire decade. And that launched a whole, so we did the 60s, 70s, 80s, and it's a lot of fun. So I think I will hopefully continue to work on the documentary side as well as the dramatizing side. I guess I could just sit here and talk all day, but I would prefer to answer as many questions as we can. And Steve mentioned the titles. I'm happy to talk about any specifics of anything I've worked on, documentary or dramatized. Let's go.
Okay. Then at this time, in your program, there's a yellow Post-it note. If you have a question you'd like Kirk to respond to, please jot it down and send it to the aisles, and the ushers will pick them up. So we'll just take a minute.
How many people here have seen John Adams? Okay. How about Band of Brothers? Okay. And the Pacific? There would be every hand here, but it's your hometown. It's your home team, guys. You got to watch that. Game Change? Does anybody know what? Game Change was an HBO movie. It was based on a bestseller the book was about the 2008 election. In fact, I can tell you the story behind that too, while we're collecting. The book is about the 2008 election. We made the movie with HBO. The initial idea was to make a movie, and this might be interesting. We were initially going to do the movie about, because the book really covers everybody. It covers, obviously, Barack Obama and John McCain, but also Hillary Clinton and Senator Edwards, and both Republican and Democratic sides, from the primaries through the general election. The initial thought was we would do the story about the rivalry between Senator Clinton and Senator Obama, and follow it through the primary election and through the election of Barack Obama. And the conceit of it, it was going to be like a heavyweight fight. That was going to be kind of the theme, and that there was a heavyweight champion, Hillary Clinton, who gets knocked off by this, kind of this newcomer that no one's really heard of, and knocks off the heavyweight champ. And there's a real drama to that. So we hired a writer, and it worked out well. I mean, wrote a very good script. The problem was, it was very interesting when you were with Hillary Clinton. And because her campaign, I don't know how many of you remember, but she had some problems, and sometimes the losing side is the more interesting side. The problem we had is when we cut to the Obama side, because I don't know if you remember what his nickname was in those days. It was No Drama Obama, because it was all so smooth. Well, no drama is not a good catchphrase if you're going to try to make a movie. So it just didn't quite work. There wasn't enough. His campaign was so smooth, and the wheels were coming off, which is always interesting to watch. But anyway, so we decided we had to recalibrate. We didn't want to give up on the project. So then we thought, what's really interesting, and this was really the inspiration of our director, Jay Roach. He said, I'd love to tell the story of how Sarah Palin was chosen as vice president for the Republican ticket. But this was in the, Tina Fey was all the rage at the time, but portraying Sarah Palin and Governor Palin, and we didn't want to do satiric. We didn't want to do anything like that. So what's the story? What's the overall conceit, if you will? Like the heavyweight bout was going to be the Obama-Clinton side. What would the Palin-McCain side be? And we decided that we would use, if anyone here has read the story of Frankenstein. Now, I quickly will add, don't mean a monster story. Don't mean that, and we very consciously did not mean that. But it's the story, the monster's name is not Frankenstein. It's Dr. Frankenstein. And it's the story of a man who very consciously, and for reasons that are understandable, which we won't get into, creates something, creates a life form. But that life form takes on a life of its own and becomes bigger than him. And he can't do anything about it, and he can't destroy it. So we decided to base the story on a guy named Steve Schmidt, who was John McCain's campaign manager. It was his idea to pick this unknown governor from Alaska as the VP for the Republicans that year. And as you know, it took on a life of its own. And Steve, very famously, went on 60 Minutes after the campaign was over, and Anderson Cooper asked him, if you could do it all over again, would you we do it differently. And he basically said, well, you don't get a do-over, but yes. In other words, the story was, it wasn't about trying to, we tried to minimize the ideology. It was somebody creating something that they lose control. And it won several Emmys and did well. So that's how we put that together. Anyway, a game changer. What else did I? Parkland. I'm sure everybody here has seen Parkland, right? Yes. One. That was
I wrote a play about the Kennedy assassination.
Oh, interesting. Well, and we made a documentary about the assassination too. And has anybody seen our CNN stuff, the 60s or 70s? Great. Okay. Well, then we have a lot to talk about. So, okay, we have.
Okay. Well, I have some questions.
Great. Yes,
we
please.
probably won't have time to go through all of them.
Oh, that's great.
Thank you for your questions.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Oh, and more. Okay. Lots more.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay. What do you wish you had known before you entered the field of documentary film production?
I wish I had been more technically astute. Because like I said, I've kind of come at this through the back door a little bit, and so I'm not caught up on digital technology, and thank God I work with great people who are, but I'm not, and you start to accumulate some knowledge, but I think that's what I wish I would have known more about that. Like I said, I wasn't anticipating this kind of fork in my career. So that's probably it. I wish I would have been more technically aware going into it.
So you had to learn on your feet once you got in.
Well, and again, I rely very much on, our DP, the team, and our editors, and I don't do that. That's not, I'm not lighting when we do interviews. I'm not doing the lighting. But I wish I had more. At this point, it's kind of hard for me to try to catch up a little bit, but it's not required, but I wish I had.
Well, can you give us a context for exactly what you do as a producer or an executive at Playtone?
Producer. Oh, that's a good question. What exactly does a producer do? Well, it depends on the
They
project.
ask the same thing about a director. And,
Yeah, a director's a little bit more. I mean, the director pretty much, and it depends on the format too. In films, the director, producer is ultimately the boss, but by and large, the director's the creator. In documentaries, it really is a producer. Now, I know a lot of documentaries have directors, but normally you'll see it's really and television is very much a producer's medium. That's why the title, executive producer title in movies, is quite often an honorary. It's an honorary title, or somehow you help raise money or something, so you get that title. Producer in motion pictures is the, that's what they give. When you win an Academy Award for Best Picture, it's given to the producer. In television, executive producer is the highest, is the top of the food chain. What I specifically do, and it really runs the gamut of a producer's responsibilities. For instance, on the CNN stuff, they came to us and said, okay, we want to do the 60s things. What does that mean? So, I figured out, how are we going to do this? What are the topics that we're going to tackle? Who should we interview? Once you have your topic, what is your, how do you approach it? How do you tell a story so that you're not just laying out a series of facts or a series of events? How do you coalesce this into some kind of coherent, dramatic story? So I tend to do more of that kind of thing, and I've done that on most, like for instance on the Game Change, the Frankenstein model was my idea. So that, choosing writers, on John Adams, that was, and all of those, the Band of Brothers, the Pacific, a large part of my job is choosing the writers and then working with them, developing. Okay, we have this book, now what are we going to do about it? And you work, a good producer is a good editor in the literary sense. Mm-hmm. That should be, if you're a creative producer, that is one of your primary jobs. It's very much like an editor working with an author.
Yeah. How do you negotiate the line between fiction and nonfiction when trying to tell a compelling story that is based in history?
Yeah, I think it depends. The further back you go in history, the more liberties you can take. I mean, this is very much what I talk about in my class. Yeah. And I think the bottom line is if you don't mess with the spirit of what you're trying to portray, it's inevitable that you're going to composite characters and you're going to telescope events. That's inevitable. We try not to do anything that's antithetical to the person you're portraying, what they were about. I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, we're very cognizant at Playtone. We're very cognizant of not making something up. Right now, we're working on another World War II another World War II miniseries for HBO. We're developing it, and it's based on the 8th Air Force in World War II, and we're concentrating on 3 particular characters in one bomb group. But we want to be able to use incidents and characters from other bomb groups. So we may put somebody in the 100th bomb group that wasn't really there. It was in the 390th. I think that's acceptable. We won't make up things, particularly about our 3 leads, and we won't do anything that's not within the spirit of the story. I think sometimes, particularly if you're doing something with World War II, you do something that we try to avoid having too modern a sensibility. How do you keep it dramatic and entertaining and exciting for a modern audience, but be true to the time? I mean, I think that's so. It's a case by case. I mean, our company is very, very cognizant of not being not making things up and not like if you can't do it, if you can't tell a true story and stay 85% true to what that story is, then pick another story.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about David McCullough?
Oh, glad.
You said you'd like to talk about that.
Well, I can talk a little bit about the making of the doc. I mean, I can talk about him all day. He and I have become friends, and he's an extraordinary man. I was telling somebody earlier today, he's the happiest person I know. But I mean, and again, he's won Pulitzer Prize for John Adams, Harry Truman. He's got, up until the last few weeks, he had the #1 bestseller in the New York Times for about 2 or 3 months, and the Wright Brothers, which we are also adapting. But we made a documentary about him, and it's available on HBO Go, and it's really one of my favorite things we ever made, I've ever worked on. I'll tell you, we knew we wanted to do something, but we weren't sure. We were thinking maybe we would take David and take him to, and basically have him follow the story of John Adams. So we would take him to Philadelphia, we would take him to Boston, and do these things, and kind of retrace the story that he wrote in the book. But we weren't sure, so myself and another producer were having cocktails with him and his wife Rosalie at a hotel bar in Boston, and he had proceeded to tell us that, in fact, he said, didn't tell us, he told his wife, he said, you know, pal, you know what tonight is? And she said, no. He said, well, it's the 60th anniversary of the night we met. Not the night, not their wedding anniversary, not even the anniversary of their first date, because the night they met wasn't their first date. The night we met. And then he proceeded to remind her what they were each wearing 60 years ago, right? And so that's what sparked the idea for us. We're going to make it about them. If you saw John Adams or read the book, you realize how central the relationship between John and Abigail Adams is. And so we realized, okay, well, so what we did is we retraced his career. And it's called Painting with Words because he didn't study history at Yale, he studied art. And so he really is a portraitist. And so what we did is we took him, we had him retrace the steps of his career. We took him over the Brooklyn Bridge. He wrote a book called The Great Bridge, which is an extraordinary story. If you don't know the story of the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, wow. And he wrote really the best book about it. So we took him and we walked across the Brooklyn Bridge. We walked around the neighborhood in Brooklyn where he lived with his wife at the time. We talked about how he came to write that book. The Library of Congress, because they are such big David McCullough fans, opened up the library early for us one day so that we could film in the library, because David McCullough became a historian because he was, in the early 60s, he was working at the USIA, United States Information Agency. And there was an exhibit of photographs from the Johnstown flood at the Library of Congress. He and his wife, and David was a Pennsylvania native, went and they looked at the photographs. He became very interested, decided to read a book about the Johnstown flood, thought it was a terrible book, said, I can do better than that, and proceeded to do just that. But the point is, for the movie, back to documentary filmmaking, they opened up the library for us early, nobody else was there, so we could, and they brought out the same photographs that they had seen 40 years earlier, and we were able to not recreate, we just turned on the camera, said, David, Rosalie, there are the photographs, just go look at them and we're just going to record. And we recorded their stroll down memory lane. We took him to Independence Hall in Philadelphia. We took him to all over Boston, and then we spent a week in his home interviewing him there on Martha's Vineyard. So, and then part of what made it work, if you think it worked, is David's also very musical, and you wouldn't expect this. He's this very distinguished Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, and he loves to sing. And he loves to sing, American standards, and one of his best friends is a piano player. So we had invited the piano player to come, and we spent probably half a day. We opened some wine, just said, and we just threw questions at him and let him sing whatever they wanted to do. And our goal was to say at the end, and if any of you see it, this is how to judge it. We wanted it to appear as if it was Mccullough home movies. Yeah. We interviewed his children, and we were on his home, and made home movies about his life, and that's what we did, and hopefully it worked.
Well, I have a question here about something unexpected that happened while shooting one of your films.
Right.
What's maybe the most challenging thing that ever happened to you while you were shooting?
Well, there's that, you know.
They don't go smoothly.
No.
You just have a plan, and then you get into challenges.
Yeah. It's General Eisenhower once said, you have to have a battle plan.
Yeah.
And that battle plan goes out the window as soon as the battle starts. And that's true in production, I think. I'm trying to think. So many things happen. Yeah. I remember we were doing the 60s, and we were going to interview a court guy, a correspondent by the name of Marvin Cowell, who was sort of a legend in broadcast news. And we were going to Uber. We had Uber pick him up. They were late. And he was really late. So by the time we were going to get an hour and a half with him, by the time he got there, I think we had a half hour. And so you have to scramble. We have all these questions to ask. What the real answer to your question is, you have to be prepared. Be prepared. And then as soon as you start filming, be prepared to improvise. So you have to be able to do both.
You've touched on this. What makes a good story?
Well, there's an infinite there. Well, go ahead.
I mean, as a documentary film producer, history is compelling. Yeah. But what makes a really good story for you?
Well, I think, it's like any story, whether it's a documentary or not. I know when we're doing the CNN series, when we approach these separate episodes, we always try to think, what's the story within it? What we do is, for those of you who haven't seen it, we take archival, essentially television footage, and then we intersperse it with interviews with either participants or experts in a particular field. But, for example, we did Watergate in the 70s. Now, that's been done quite often, and a lot of people are very familiar, but we didn't. How do we make a story out of it? We have 42 minutes to tell the story of Watergate.
And how do you do it in a way that isn't going to be the same old, same
So we decided we would make it, we would open with President Nixon landing in China, literally at the apex of his career. He's on top of the world. He was heading into an election where he would be reelected overwhelmingly, and we show that right away. So he literally is landing. He's at the apex of his career, and at the end, most of us have seen. We know we're going out on the helicopter as he leaves the plane. So what does that story suggest? Well, it suggested to me a Greek tragedy, and a Greek tragedy, and the definition of a tragic hero is that their tragic flaw, the thing that brings them down, is within themselves. And we very much saw President Nixon that way. So everything we did was about that. We kept that at the center of the story. So we never mentioned Woodward Bernstein. They're important, but we show them. But it's not about that. It's about how did this man go from here and go to there. And you keep that in mind. So I think if you always have, you start here and where do you end up, and do all the steps in between have to lead a dramatic logic from here to there.
Wow. Yeah, and in seeing that series, the arc was very clear.
Yes.
The precipitous fall of the hero.
Yes. And so, you can't always do that. Like we have, we did a episode on the British invasion, which is about the Beatles, essentially. And then the other, there's no fall. It's just the Beatles. Of course, you love it. So, you also have no one to get out of the way, too. When you have the Beatles, and you have that, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and the other groups, what we decided, we didn't want to just do the Beatles. So, how did the Beatles come over and affect American music? So, it was the initial title was British Invasion and the American Response. Because we had to figure out a way, how do you get Bob Dylan, the Beach Boys, and Motown, and how do you get all that? Yeah. You can't do American music in the 60s and not do all that. So, sometimes it's just putting the puzzle pieces together, too.
Okay. You mentioned that how the veterans in World War II rejoined civilian life, and there wasn't huge focus on that. How difficult was it to research their testimonies and to make those portrayals authentic?
It would have been almost impossible if we didn't. What we did is we focused on some of the men that we portrayed in Band of Brothers in the Pacific. So we knew them. so we interviewed them. But otherwise, it's not that well documented from their own testimony. Now, there was a fair amount. The title of the show is actually based on a War Department short. It's really interesting. The War Department made a film called He Has Seen War, and it was shown on the home front as the war was winding down. It was shown before, in those days, before a feature film, they would show newsreels, and this was part of a newsreel, and it was like a 10-minute film, and it basically said, listen, that 19-year-old kid you sent to Italy, to France, to the Pacific is not the same. He's not the same man. He's not a boy anymore. He has seen war, and it was extraordinarily candid. I mean, we think of earlier times as being somehow innocent. Well, there's no way you could be during World War II. There's no innocence. So we saw. So there was a great deal of War Department footage. A lot of articles were written, but the men themselves were not. They didn't talk about their experience. I mean, that's kind of become a cliche that the men didn't talk about their experience, but they really didn't. So if it hadn't been for the men that we already knew from portraying them in the two series and being able to interview them, it would have been nearly impossible to get firsthand testimony.
Wow. I've had a couple of questions as I've been flipping through them about negative consequences or any negative reactions to your portrayals of especially Game Change.
Yeah. Game Change, I think there was a little bit. I think Governor Palin had said of some public things, but not much. I think she probably wisely didn't comment on it too much. Not very much. I mean, we had the cooperation of everybody we portrayed except for Senator McCain and Governor Palin. We talked to everybody else. And then it was based on a book by John Howland and Mark Halperin, and they turned over their sources, and they were integral to so very little. And like I said, I think what we also, in fact, rather than negative, we heard from a lot of people who thought we showed a different side to Governor Palin. She became caricatured and had her main caricatured so often, and we tried to show that here was somebody who, man, she was just dropped into this out of nowhere, and I say unprepared, and I don't mean that in a critical light. I mean, we literally meet her. She's at the state fair as a mom, as governor in Alaska. She gets the call from Steve Schmidt and the McCain campaign. Hey, we're interested in talking to you, and like her whole life changed. So she was a little unprepared, and that's what we wanted to show the human side, not the human side. That's not a good phrase, but to show a different side, the personal side of what it was like, and the toll that it took on her. So I mean, there was some criticism, but not too much. I'll tell you a story in terms of criticism. I got after we did the Pacific, I decided one Veterans Day, to call. We get all these letters, particularly Tom Hanks gets so many letters, and a lot of them end up on my desk from veterans. And I decided I was going to call one of them one day, and it was a Marine who served on Guadalcanal in New Jersey, and he sent this whole he put it together a calendar with the different days that meant something in his life, his wedding day, the birth of his first child, his grandchild, his first job, all these things. And he puts this together, and it was very moving, and I was very touched, and Tom was very touched. So I called him out of the blue, and he was shocked, that I had called him, one of the reasons I called him is he also included this long letter criticizing the show. And it was, we didn't do that, and we didn't say that, we didn't wear that. And so I called him, and we talked about it. And I realized very quickly, though, that he was telling me all that. The criticisms were all, but we would never not wear a shirt in the child line, kind of critique. And I realized what he was really saying was, I was there, I know. So he wasn't really, he loved the series, but, it was his way of saying, I was there. And because he couldn't, all those guys, they would never brag about it. They say, I was there, I know, and I took that hill. Wouldn't do that, but they would tell you by saying, well, we didn't really curse that much. That kind of thing.
Well, I've had a number of questions concerning the process of making these documentary films. are there any main stages that you guys go through?
Yes.
Can you describe those for some of the students in the audience?
Sure. I mean, it depends on the project, and there's no uniform way. There's a form. The only formula I would say is, again, to identify what your story is and how you want to tell it. But I think most documentaries in any film, you have that what they call the development stage. And that's where you're figuring out what story do you want to tell and how do you tell it, and then what are the elements you're going to tell it with. Like, again, the CNN stuff. We have a very large research staff, and they're researchers and they're co-producers, and we say, here's what we want to cover, here's the story we want to tell, here's how we want to tell it, and then we spend months looking at footage, and then we start identifying the people we want to interview. But I think it's a gathering time. That development time is that you're gathering what the thing is, that aha moment. Aha, that's the story I want to tell. Then the next shoe to drop has got to be how are we going to tell it? How am I going to tell it? Then you have to gather the elements that you use, and that can be depends on what the story is. If it's go out in the street and follow people around, or dig through the archives for footage. I mean, that's what depends.
How important has networking been, or your networking skills, in your career?
Less than most people, just because I was very lucky. Playtone, it's not my first producing job, but, I've not had to network yet. Very important in the sense that I knew Tom Hanks' partner. So that way, they were forming Playtone, and his name is Gary Guessman, and he and Tom do everything together. You see his name, and whenever you see Tom, you see his name on everything, and many more things than I do. It's his company, so like we did Mamma Mia, the movie. I did My Big Fat Greek Wedding. Gary produced all of them, so I was part of it. Wow. So anyway, but I know him, and that was the only networking I had to do. So I've been very fortunate, but you do have to. And I would say this: as your career progresses. Take whatever job you can get, and always do the job at hand as if I'll tell you a story of a young guy who worked at Playtone as an intern, and he went to school in New York, and we were in Los Angeles. He was in Los Angeles for the summer, and we hired him as an intern, and he was great, and we noticed him because he did every job. Whether it didn't matter what it was, you knew that was the most important thing in his life at that moment. And Indy was very smart and affable, and that was all great. So, cut to about a year later, we had a job opening, and we said, well, let's hire one of our interns, our former interns. And we all, immediately, Josh, it was just a consensus. And we found Josh had actually moved to LA and had taken a job at DreamWorks. So, we recruited him out of DreamWorks. and that's how much we wanted. And again, all he had been as an intern, and really, you just knew from his attitude and the way he approached his job, his internship. So he worked as a PA for several years, and that would mean sometimes his job was making copies, and sometimes it would be going to all the cliche PA stuff, go get the copy, but more and more. And then Playtone is a very informal atmosphere, so you're rubbing elbows with some pretty big people. And so you get to know somebody. But the point is, Josh never, and eventually, Tom Hanks had a kind of a project that he was very interested in. And there wasn't a lot of other enthusiasm in the company, let's say, for this project. And so he turned to Josh, our intern, and said, Josh, why don't you come help me write this? Right? Now, he's not an intern anymore, now he's a PA. And so he would spend part of several days a week writing scripts for it turned out to be a series on the internet that actually was made. It was called, I'm drawing a blank, but something that actually was made. It was on the internet. And he would spend part of his day writing a script with Tom Hanks. But he's still a PA. So people would say, Josh, can you, not go get coffee, we wouldn't do that, but hey Josh, can you go get something out of the library for me? Or Josh, can you get somebody on the phone? Or something like that. And he did both to the best of his ability. And what happened, so he today is a very successful producer, cut to the bottom line, went out, was hired by Microsoft, of all people, to produce, and this is coming right out of Playtime, to produce, is it, what, Dawn, there was a video game? What's it called? Until Dawn, yeah. So he was the producer. Microsoft wanted to do a 90-minute movie, and off the strength of his time at Playtime. But the key is, every task he had, whether it was writing a script with the biggest movie star in the world, or collating a script, he did it, and he did it great. So I can't stress that enough. You will be noticed if you do the best job, however menial you think it is. That's how you will be noticed when you first start out. I promise you.
Yes, and this question sort of speaks to that and goes a little further. Research methods students often ask how they will be researchers outside of academia.
Right.
Discuss how documentation would approach research to accurately portray the stories.
Sure. I mean, there are positions. There are research positions if that's what you're interested in. It is a specialty. It's not a position that usually leads to producing or directing or anything like that. It is we hired somebody on the 60s who was one of Ken Burns' researchers. But so you can do that. I mean, how you actually get into that field specifically, I don't know. I mean, that's something, if you want to forward some specific, like some of your students have questions and want specific advice as to where to go, you and I can, if you want to forward them to me, I can ask our researchers. But that is a real position, particularly documentary film, particularly historically based and archival. I mean, there are, everything now is on film, or on tape, or not, I mean, digital, I should say. So there are people, that is their job, and they go out and find, right? We now have, I think, 4 researchers, and that's all they do. They're not producers or nothing else. They go out and find the footage. So that's a real position. I can't give you specific information as to who you call, but I can help you if there's anybody that's specific.
Sure, we'd be
Sure.
grateful. I'll make sure it gets to the right places. This is a question, it's very detailed, but I think you may want to talk about this. Tell me more about the ordeal in detail about John Adams, and specifically the episode that involved the White House and his estate Peacefield.
Okay. Ordeal. Yes, there was something that could be an ordeal. Well, I mean, there are 2 different things. I mean, John Adams was the first occupant of the White House, and Peacefield was his home that he retired to and actually lived in that was built before he became president and where he retired. Part of the challenge, well, I'll tell you, part of the challenge is recreating it. I mean, that's where we try to be as accurate as possible. So we had a great art department. And you search, of course there were no photographs, but the drawings and the paintings and the descriptions and letters. And then you build it, you build it to as close as you possibly can. We created Peacefield and the White House, and we shot most of John Adams in Richmond, Virginia. And so it's a matter of doing, that's again, research. Like art, that's another thing you can do is research. They can specialize. Art departments and wardrobe departments, and the production designer and the costume designer hire and rely on their researchers. Absolutely. I mean, those are real legitimate positions. Now, this is not documentary. This is in dramatized work. But that's a real position, and they spend weeks, if not months, researching before they do anything. Is to get it, again, if you have the luxury of working for somebody like HBO, who really prides themselves on doing things as accurately as possible. Yeah. And getting the minute detail as accurate as possible is very important. And it puts the people who are working on it in the mood. In other words, you feel, when we did the Pacific and Band of Brothers, Like we did the Pacific, the guys, there were no trailers, there were no tents. We were out in Australia under the sun or under the elements all day. And I say we, but mainly the actors, because it just creates this camaraderie and it creates an atmosphere of this is what it is. This is what it was like. It's kind of, you know what the method acting is. Well, it's kind of method production.
Yeah.
You can't always afford to do that, and you don't usually go to the extremes that we did in the Pacific. But you try to, the more authentic you can be, I think it permeates the entire, everybody on the production.
Yeah, yeah. So then the authenticity oozes out.
Yes, if you're encouraging talented people to display their talent that way.
Yeah.
You're really giving them the opportunity to put their best talented foot forward that way, and encouraging their talent.
I've got just a few more questions for you. I've had several questions about what inspired you, or what inspired you to get into the field that you're in. Out of a history degree, how did you ever get into film production?
Yes.
And then what works of documentary film have inspired you?
Right. Well, inspired. That's probably more of a lofty term than I was looking for a job. And but I mean, without getting into the detail, when I got out of, I wasn't quite sure. I have 2 degrees in history, like I said. I wasn't quite sure. I thought maybe I wanted to teach.
Yeah.
I contemplated maybe trying to join the State Department. But what I did instead is kick around, and then I started a couple of different careers. But I fell into a job managing a location in Los Angeles, and I won't get into all the details of this. But I fell into a job that exposed me to production, and then I did meet some. Then I knew some people who were enjoying some success, and now that I was in their field, they invited me to join them, working with them. So it wasn't so much an inspiration, other than I needed a job, and I through UCLA. I don't know. UCLA has a placement center, so if you're a graduate, it was very helpful. I don't know what Montevallo does, but it was very, very helpful. I heard this job. It just sounded fascinating. I didn't necessarily want to get into the movies or anything. It's just a fascinating job, and it just kind of took off that way. So it wasn't a matter of that, but I love it. I mean, and it wasn't. And I'm, like I said, I'm very fortunate that I work for a company that is so focused on telling historical stories.
Yes, yes.
So it's just been a good fit.
And I know on your website you talk a lot about the importance of telling a story. Is that the most compelling part of what you do?
Telling a story?
Storytelling?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And that's actually the UCLA website. Yes, absolutely. It's the point of my class. You know, that's really the bottom line. If you have a project, you have to. How do you mold this into some kind of dramatic logic to tell a story? And the thing I always tell students is read. That's the best single piece of advice I can give you is to read. I don't care what it is, but read, because you need to develop an aesthetic. You need to develop your own sense of taste, whatever it is, whatever the genre, whether it's documentaries, whether it's other kinds of formats that you want to get into. But read and develop a sense of what a story is. It's the only way you can develop a sense of story. You're not going to get it just from watching television, let alone watching 3-minute things on the internet. Read novels, read history, and develop a sense of what a story is to you. And then it will come. But I don't know anybody successful in Hollywood, and I kid you not, who is not an avid reader. I mean, on a writer, an actor, certainly writers and directors, and most producers. I don't know any of them who aren't avid readers. It kind of goes hand in hand. So if you want to be a storyteller, if you want to create, even if it's in a documentary field, read. Wherever your taste leads you, but read.
One final question. What is a story in history that you have not told before, not yet,
Right.
but want to tell at some point in your career?
Yeah. Well, there's many of those. The two that come to the top of my head is the building of the Brooklyn Bridge.
Yeah.
HBO has the rights to David's book, so we'll see what happens. It's an extraordinary story. That's the other thing. There are so many there are thousands, if not millions, of real, true stories. Who knew that the building, until I read David's book, the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, and at the center of it is another extraordinary romance and relationship. Who knows here that as much as that a woman was responsible, as much as anybody, for the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. I'm very few. If you go to the Brooklyn Bridge, there is a plaque on the bridge, and basically, and part of it is it ends. It thanks a lot of people, and essentially, it thanks Emily, the wife of the chief engineer, because he developed the bends. If you've ever seen the Brooklyn Bridge, it goes down about 200 feet, and he developed the bends going down and coming up too fast and with unpressurized air. He became very ill for the last few years of the building of the bridge. And he was bedridden, literally bedridden in an apartment in Brooklyn, and he couldn't leave their apartment. And so she did it for him. So she was his eyes and ears on the bridge every day. This was in the 1880s, right? So she's having to negotiate with. Now she wasn't an engineer; she didn't design it, but she had to do that. She basically became the foreman. So can you imagine this? Now, who knew this? And they have this kind of relationship. And so much more, the accidents and all that. So that story. And then I've been thinking, dramatize the Constitutional Convention. I don't think a day goes by in America where you don't pick up a newspaper, watch the news, go on the internet, read something. The Constitution is referred to constantly. Obviously it's our founding document. People use it as a political cudgel. It's one of the works of political genius of all time, obviously. How did it come about? And real men at the time put this together. They compromised, they argued, and they fashioned this thing. And before it's all over, I would love to. If you saw John Adams, our second episode was about the fight for the declare independence, and we try to do it as if it was like a political convention. Well, I would like to do that with the Constitutional Convention.
Wow. Well, I hope you have an opportunity to tell those two stories before you end your career. And when you do, I hope we can have you back to talk about your experiences with our students and faculty. Yes.
No.
And I want to thank Kirk for coming to University of Montevallo and for speaking with us today.
You bet.
We really appreciate and celebrate the fact that you're here and telling these great stories. So thank you for inspiring us all.
My pleasure.
Wait, hang on. I'm sorry.
Don't want to get in your way.